Hundreds of years ago, the lost but not necessarily forgotten city of Ulu was at the forefront of research on the Abyss, that outer plane in which vile demons are birthed, that violent, malevolent place where even the landscape itself twists and torments the very soul and the mind. A place of such utter chaos and evil that it is guaranteed to have something you will despise. Despite all of the precautions that may or may not have been taken by the inhabitants of Ulu, the city ultimately fell, and would for a time be forgotten by the continent at large. Until recently. Here's a question for the veteran D&D players watching. What creature from D&D would you least expect to hire the party to carry out a particular quest? This was a question I broadly posed to my fellow Dungeon Jam content creators, and they came up with some interesting answers. Between flumps, gibbering mouthers, Kuotoa, skeletons, elderbrains, nightwalkers, gelatinous cubes, gargoyles, and any number of weird and fantastical creatures, you could easily guess amongst thousands of monsters. However, I bet that if I gave all of you 1,000 guesses, that there is a non-zero chance that someone would eventually think of black dragons. G'day mates, my name is Mordecai. Dungeon Jam is a yearly event hosted by Mystic Arts in Nagobi, where a whole bundle of creators create a dungeon for the broader community to enjoy playing with their respective groups. This year, the 5-room dungeon I've created involves the party being hired by a black dragon. Before we delve into the dungeon that the dragon is hiring the party to conquer, there are a few things that need some explanation. A 5-room dungeon is a design philosophy for organising tightly designed dungeons. They consist of 5 scenes, taking place within distinct rooms. A scene for starting the dungeon, role-playing, puzzle-solving, combat, and the finale. That first scene of the dungeon is what draws the party into the adventure, and much like the finale, could include combat or other challenges. The 5-room dungeon, being a set of guidelines rather than hard rules, doesn't have to include a dedicated role-playing, combat, or puzzle scene. Nor does the dungeon have to be an actual dungeon. For this 5-room dungeon, I wanted to push some of the boundaries on this paradigm, to push it to the limits. To that end, this particular 5-room dungeon is designed with an intended finale in mind. There is a pivotal choice that the party can make, and what rooms are encountered and whether the party gets a good or bad ending depends on that decision. It means that this 5-room dungeon is dynamic, which in turn results in the design and what counts as a room needing to be somewhat flexible. We really have to stretch the definition of a room. Perhaps it is rather appropriately thematic, given that this dungeon is not exactly a traditional dungeon per se. And what better place to start with stretching definitions than with the quest giver themselves? Now, why would anyone guess that the quest giver is a black dragon? Typically, black dragons are sadistic, solitary, and extremely territorial ambush hunters. They have an extremely foul temperament, being rather prone to anger, and being quite pretentious. They predominantly inhabit swamps, with preference to those which are particularly murky, dank, and fetid. Don't even get me started on the putrid and frankly rank smell of rotting vegetation they have, because that ties in with the effect their presence has on surrounding lands, namely making water foul and completely undrinkable, and the mud and vegetation within their domains become thick and difficult to traverse. They also value seeing the collapse of humanoid kingdoms, hoarding treasures from such in a quest to prove just how great they are. So what makes this particular black dragon trustworthy enough to be a quest giver? Allow me to explain. One of my favourite homebrew mechanics has to do with how alignment affects the physical appearance of dragons, because I am a sucker for the subversion of expectations. The mechanic is that the good to evil axis of the alignment spectrum is reflected on dragons by how shiny and reflective their scales are. If you have a dragon with shiny scales that reminds you of metals and or mirrors, you've got a good aligned dragon. A dull sheen with this malevolent aura to them, and you have one that is evil. So most people who see a chromatic dragon immediately think it's evil, as that's the expectation, until you notice that the scales are akin to a mirror and seem to reflect light to a degree. The quest giver is one such exceptional black dragon, and there are quite a few differences between a conventional black dragon and our quest giver besides the sheen of his scales. With that, let's get into the dungeon itself, starting with fluff and background, some of which is specific to the setting that I've been working on at the time of this video. Welcome to the region of Valtasar, the swamplands on the southern side of the subcontinent Anglos. Anglos is part of the Tidal Reef Archipelago, which is considered to be a continent for world-building purposes. On the southeastern coastal area, close to where the mangrove swamps start to recede into plains, we have Port Evercarn, a major trading hub for the region and to elsewhere in Tidal Reef. Further inland, deep within the swamp, is where we find the frontier outpost town of Larnwick, a town that is well known for being on the outer edge of the territory, known to be claimed by a rather particular black dragon. Larnwick draws a lot of interest because of the ongoing archaeological work on uncovering some nearby ruins. Ruins that were recently discovered to correlate to the lost city of Ulu-Nere. The same Ulu-Nere that was once at the forefront of arcane research on the Abyss. However, with its history and discoveries lost to time, now only being slowly uncovered by archaeologists, the true horrors that lie in wait remain unknown. Interest in these ancient ruins, especially the ziggurat, has brought in considerable additional trade with the wider region around the swamp, and with the rest of Anglos. Larnwick was once just a much simpler frontier outpost for explorers and adventurers. Thanks to these recent developments, it now sometimes serves as a resting stop for caravans en route to other cities and towns in the surrounding regions. Outside of the emerging archaeological interest in Ulu-Nere, its local hunting and medicinal herb trade keeps it on most maps of the region. And it is here that the 5-room dungeon begins. The village of Larnwick, serving as a frontier outpost deep in the southern mangrove swamps of Anglos, stands as a rare beacon of civilization within these murky lands. The many wooden houses with rounded thatch roofs are complemented with the assortment of other buildings, including those more recently constructed that consist of stone. These buildings made from stone include a blacksmith, a library, and a trading outpost for passing caravans, whilst the older buildings consist of a tavern, the herbalist's shop, and the hunter's station. The land upon which the village is built is raised above the swampy waters that surround the village. Even the roads leading in and out of the village are similarly raised, with the trade route roads being paved cobblestone. To the north lies a small dock where canoes are moored for exploration, and on the outer edge near those docks is the campsite that serves as the place for any visiting archaeologists. Perhaps the party are here because they are seeking out fortunes from amongst the ruins, or they are here because of their own interests in the region. This is our starting scene, the inciting incident that draws the party into the adventure. As the party are going about their business in Larnwick, be it hanging out in the tavern, or engaging in trade with the herbalist or the blacksmith, news spreads quickly around a town this small. A letter has recently been delivered to the archaeologists from their excursions deep into the swamp, and several of them are heading through town in search of an adventuring party to assist. Depending on how well known the party are, they could be recognised by some of these archaeologists. At this stage, gathering the party together so that they can all read the letter that has been received is vital, as that's part of the letter's request. The request letter reads as follows. Greetings to any and all interested adventurers. As part of efforts in discovering the origins and history of the ruins buried beneath the swamplands of Anglos, I have been gladly supporting the archaeological teams that are presently investigating Ulu-Nere. As the local guardian of the land in which these ruins are located, I am coordinating those teams, whilst using my lair as a base camp for digs that are deeper within the swamps. To that end, I have recently learnt of a concerning development in the area. Since I have taken up supervising the archaeologists and partaking in the dig myself, I've asked all archaeological teams to work with me and the other teams. However, this hasn't stopped incursions from unregistered archaeologists or bandits. To that end, I am requesting a suitable group to help investigate this development. I have included a map with this request, detailing a safe route to my lair, where I can provide more information on where the most recent incursion is. Above all, I am interested in making sure that, if it is a legitimate archaeology team, that all of their efforts are coordinated. The reward for investigating and neutralizing or otherwise mitigating the disturbance could include a selection of old magic items that are not presently in use, some knowledge that I have accrued that would be useful to adventurers, or some of the gold from my personal hoard. Kind regards, Urquazan Rosnar. The map attached to this letter has an X indicating where Urquazan Rosnar's lair is located, and as suggested from the letter, a marked pathway that cuts through the mangrove swamp from Larnwick to his lair. In the case it doesn't immediately become obvious from the wording and the way the letter was written, a closer inspection with a successful insight or investigation check reveals that the letter and the X on the map were indeed written by a dragon in their true form. As part of this introduction scene, the players are still free to explore the town of Larnwick, and to ask the locals for more information about Urquazan Rosnar. The general consensus of the town is that, despite his chromatic heritage as a black dragon, that he is an exception, a guardian of lost and forgotten history, and someone who highly values people and living civilizations. However, there are a few townspeople that have specific details that they can bring up and provide. The Dwarven blacksmith, for example, will talk about how Urquazan Rosnar is something of a rival in the world of metalsmithing. The hunters of the village would express that they are thankful that they don't have to deal with the regional effects that a black dragon would normally afflict the territory around their lair with. And as for the chief librarian, she would comment about how Urquazan Rosnar seems frequently dismayed by the thought of the potential for the downfall of any civilization. Speaking of, when the party does proceed towards the lair, there are several details that will stand out. For starters, despite the swamp being littered with mangrove trees and being dense with other vegetation, the pathway indicated by the map attached to the letter is surprisingly tidy, bearing signs of extensive foot traffic. It also cuts right through the vegetation, and much like the trade route roads leading in and out of Larnwick, it's elevated above the water that steadily clears up as they follow the road. A successful Arcana check would reveal that the region is under the influence of a dragon's lair effects, but that the effects being observed are atypical for a black dragon. Instead of the region being overtly hostile, it's as though it's been altered to be as accommodating as possible. As the party follows this dirt path deep into the swamps, they'll start to see this large grey stone resembling a spiral seashell jutting out from the ground. And it certainly looks large enough to house a dragon. Arriving at Urquazan Rosnar's lair, the party finds a deep pit beside the seashell that seems to stretch beneath the swamp, complete with a dugout ramp leading down deep into the earth. If the party opts to peer into the seashell, they will observe a fairly large bookshelf to the immediate left, along with a site for a campfire and a suitably large bed of hay. On the opposite side to the entrance is this water trough, which is close to a small workshop area with an anvil that is appropriately sized for a dragon, as well as a furnace. In front of the anvil is what initially appears to be a steel sculpture of a saber-toothed tiger, but upon closer examination, it's a construct that seems to be asleep. The water trough is noteworthy for the Dungeon Master, as unbeknownst to the party, hidden deep within it is not only an escape route, but is also where the hoard is safely kept. Whilst the lair and the pit are surrounded by swampy water, the pit itself has been dried out, as it is one of the archaeological dig sites. Within this pit, there is an arrangement of odd-looking stones that are slowly being carefully excavated by a small team. A small team that includes an adult black dragon. This leads into the intended roleplay scene for the 5-room dungeon, formally meeting and talking to the quest giver in person. So let's talk about who Urquhart Rosnar is. Urquhart Rosnar carries himself with this pride and confidence of being the region's respected guardian, a stark contrast against the mud that he's covered in as a result of digging around. He sees the party as guests within his territory, which is also how he sees the archaeological teams within said territory that are investigating Eidolon. Once he realises that the party are there, which may take a round or two since he was digging in the pit alongside the archaeologists that are present, he apologises profusely for not noticing the party sooner. His mannerisms are polite, well-spoken and somewhat verbose, opting to sometimes go into too much detail about the archaeological findings, as though he's akin to an overly eager yet helpful university professor studying the archaeological find of the year, rather than the in-the-field archaeologist that he is acting as. His interests outside of archaeology and history include the study of the arcane and his various projects as an artificer. He highly values history and its preservation, as he sees the downfall of older civilizations as both tragedy and warning to the future. He also takes great care to ensure both he and his territory are presentable and accommodating to welcome outsiders. Besides introducing himself to the party and making sure that he is accommodating them, he will go into detail about his request. He explains that recently, the wildlife in the swamp have spoken to him about an unusual group of suspicious-looking archaeologists. These suspicious archaeologists have occupied a section of the nearby ruins that was on the plans to eventually study, but not for another month. As he is conversing, he would speculate that the section in question might hold some critical information on what caused the downfall of Eidolon, which he is certain happened a long time before he arrived here. At this time, whilst he suspects that these occupants might be bandits due to them not being registered with the other archaeological teams, he wants to know for certain. That's where the party comes in. Simply put, he wants to have that occupied section of ruins preserved for later documentation, preferably whilst keeping said section intact. Killing the suspected bandits could be helpful, but isn't a requirement if conflict can be avoided. After all, Urquhart Rosnar merely suspects that these are bandits, but doesn't know for certain. He will also ask the party to consider keeping it on the down low that they are working for him when dealing with the bandits as they see fit. He would advise discretion until the party is absolutely certain. He also would volunteer to assist the party more directly if they were to bring him some proof of them being foul and nefarious villains. But his first priority is to help the archaeology team that's right next to his lair, since it is his lair and all. If the party asks Urquhart Rosnar or the archaeologists about what they have found out as part of the ongoing archaeology, they can learn about what has been recovered, and about how the other teams are doing. Aside from the name of the ruined city being Eidolon, the archaeologists have learnt that the city was conducting research on the Abyss, and that presently it is strongly suspected that the ziggurat, deep in the swamp and mentioned on other sections of ruins, was the centre of all research the inhabitants conducted. As well, there are two teams of archaeologists working on excavating the area around the ziggurat, hoping to uncover how the ziggurat aided in such research. At this point, we have to talk about the choice the players have as part of this dungeon. Because it is a choice whether or not to fight Urquhart Rosnar, either now or slightly later on, which will guarantee a bad ending to the story, as fighting this black dragon is the alternative finale to the dungeon. Since fighting Urquhart Rosnar could be the finale to the dungeon, how does he fight? Urquhart Rosnar is similar enough to most adult black dragons, in that he has a potent acid breath, can fly, and is a strong opponent. He is, however, also a capable spellcaster, and calls upon his talents as an artificer to do so. And he will also call upon his Steel Defender to aid in battle. This Steel Defender will immediately dash from its resting place within Urquhart Rosnar's lair upon being called out to. It is this construct, made out of this acid-resistant steel, with a design that is loosely based on a saber-toothed tiger. It is the same construct that would have been seen in his lair earlier if the party took a peek inside. However, Urquhart Rosnar has priorities that affect how he battles. As he fights, he will order the archaeologists to quickly flee back to Larnwick, to alert the town and the other archaeologists to the treachery of the party. His Steel Defender will prioritize defending those civilians as they flee, positioning itself between the party and the archaeologists if it can. Whilst these archaeologists are less fragile than commoners, they are still quite vulnerable. Hence why Urquhart Rosnar will also position himself such that his acid breath won't hit any of his allies. If the party decides to attack the archaeologists intentionally with, say, a fireball, that is something he will attempt to counterspell, but only if the archaeologists are in the fireball, otherwise he will tank the damage. Once the civilians have fled, he will then bring his full might upon the party. It is worth mentioning which version of Counterspell Urquhart Rosnar has access to. In the original release of 5th edition, Counterspell rules, and is easily an S+ tier spell if we were to do some silly gag involving spell lists and what tier each spell slots into. You cast it as a reaction, and if your counterspell is of a high enough level, or you roll well enough on your spellcasting check, you negate the opponent's spell and prevent its effects. That's awesome, and makes Counterspell a top tier pick. Now let's talk about the 2024 version of Counterspell, because this version instead invokes a Constitution saving throw from the opponent, and if they fail, only then is the spell countered. Oh, and it refunds that spell slot. I guess it's better for the players to be on the receiving end of, but it's entirely pointless. I'd rather not have this version of Counterspell at all. Suffice to say, Urquhart Rosnar uses the original version of Counterspell I described earlier. In this finale, once the archaeologists have safely fled, Urquhart Rosnar will flee from combat himself after a round, as he would consider his own death to be a lament for the region. That whole bringing his full might is a bluff, meant to shake the confidence of the party. However, if all of the archaeologists were killed by the party, Urquhart Rosnar will have to make a DC 20 Wisdom saving throw against himself. He cannot use a legendary resistance for this saving throw. If he fails, he will commit to killing the party, if he can, as he would see them as too dangerous to be allowed to live. Otherwise, he will instead flee towards Larnwick to warn them about the party himself. If Urquhart Rosnar dies, the area around his lair would immediately begin to alter, as his lair magic recedes. The water would once more become very murky, the air would regain its stench of decay, and the wildlife would become readily agitated. Regardless of whether Urquhart Rosnar flees or dies, this finale and the dungeon as written concludes moments later. A strange human, whom the party would have met if they decided to fight Urquhart Rosnar later after meeting with the bandits, dressed in a deep blue robe, would appear from behind the party, thanking them for their service. A service that they have contributed towards by dealing with the Black Dragon. As part of the thanks, he explains that the party are free to loot Urquhart Rosnar's lair, if they can find his hoard. However, the party is advised to do so soon, as the new chief inheritor of Eidolon has claimed the city as his own, and the party, despite their service, are no longer welcome. As this charming individual is speaking, the local region will start to become enveloped in this shroud of distinctly unnatural darkness, as though something new and dangerous, something perhaps akin to a dragon, is exerting its influence on the region. If the party returns to Larnwick, they are met with hostility and distrust, as word would have already spread about the party from either the fleeing archaeologists, Urquhart Rosnar himself, or from the emerging Veil of Evil. Not to mention that a new threat has emerged, a genuine threat to the region. I present this alternative finale as what it is intended to be. An alternative. It is an option, sure, but an option that the players most likely would not pick. Urquhart Rosnar is established as a good aligned dragon after all, a rare exception to the norm for black dragons, and given his established reputation with the wider region, picking a fight with him is guaranteed to result in a bad ending. However, this choice is not an unfounded one, which brings us to what the puzzle scene is for this dungeon. By and large, the puzzle scene is more of an amorphous scene, as it most likely includes the combat scene as part of the puzzle. The main aspect of the puzzle is whether or not the party makes the decision to fight Urquhart Rosnar. But if they choose not to fight Urquhart Rosnar at all, there is an actual puzzle, one that can help the party understand the history of Yul and Neray and what they are up against for the actual finale. So let's continue with how the dungeon is intended to progress from the roleplay scene. After learning of where the suspected bandits are located within the swamp, the archaeologists and Urquhart Rosnar will allow the party to take one of the docked canoes from this dock up here, if they choose to use the canoes. For the purposes of easing the presentation of this dungeon, I am going to present it as though the party have opted for the use of the canoes. As the party row towards the section of the ruins, the more observant will, between the mangrove trees and the vegetation, observe the semblance of a campsite, jutting out near this raised hexagonal altar, along with a ruined pillar off to the side. The altar is largely covered in a steep incline of mud that's hard to climb on the sides, however this front section has been excavated such that the stairs are accessible. From the canoes, the party can also spot a total of 4 figures, each of whom are wearing deep blue robes. One of these figures is inspecting the altar itself, with 2 others investigating the pillar. The last one is by the campsite, keeping an eye out, seemingly for anything suspicious, including the party that seems to be approaching. If anyone is wondering if these folks are cultists, the answer to that question is yes. And yes, the manner in which these cultists are acting is ominous, to say the least. So let's throw some names and descriptions to these cultists, beyond them wearing robes. From what the party can see, these cultists are a group of 3 humans and a lizard folk, with the lizard folk closely examining the altar. However, the lookout by the campsite would be beckoning the party closer, almost as though inviting them to speak. If the party decides to go for a more diplomatic route to get more information, the lookout is willing to introduce themselves and their companions to the party. The lookout is Edwin Caradus, and whilst he seems friendly enough, there is a rough edge to his tone, almost as though he's expecting hostility from the party. The 2 others by the pillar are the Pilar brothers, Yosel and Yarrel. The last of these cultists is Zenabar, the lizard folk that's examining the altar. Oh, and just in case viewers are curious, in the alternative finale, Edwin is the chap who congratulates the party for their service. As the party are conversing, there are several oddities with the discussion with Edwin that should tip them off. He will assert that the Black Dragon cannot be trusted, and that he will betray the archaeologists when the time is right. He's previously heard the tales about how Urquhart Rosnar is some benevolent chromatic, but he's still a chromatic. He's still sadistic and cruel deep down within. Or so Edwin insists. Edwin is obviously lying. However, his train of thought is that by sending the party back to fight Urquhart Rosnar, instead of annoying his group, it frees up said group to continue with whatever malarkey they are up to. The immediate puzzle here is whether or not the party trust Edwin over the villagers of Larnwick, the archaeologists, and Urquhart Rosnar himself. Which, Urquhart Rosnar has been entirely honest with everything he has said and done, and the party are free to do a retroactive insight check against Urquhart Rosnar to be sure if they want to. As the conversation progresses, Edwin should be getting increasingly impatient with the party, with certain phrases and suggestions escalating this impatience. If the party, say, insists to Edwin that they need to follow the proper procedures and coordinate with the other archaeology groups, Edwin will rebuke and brush that off, citing that he won't allow Urquhart Rosnar to dictate how they are to operate as archaeologists. If the party persists, Edwin will try to once more convince the group to go back and deal with Urquhart Rosnar. At this point, if the party decides to stick around and continue trying to converse with Edwin, he will announce that he and his allies will not allow any further intervention against the inheritors and their goals. At which point, it's time to roll initiative. This brings us into our combat scene, the party fighting against these cultists. All three of the human cultists are competent fighters, with Edwin and Yarrell drawing swords, whilst Yozel utilizes a longbow, keeping his distance and plinking away with arrows. However, the lizard folk by the altar has different plans. On the first turn that Zenibar takes, he grabs something from the altar and immediately wild shapes into a demonic creature known as a Chasme. This disgusting humanoid fly-like creature that's making this horrendous ear-piercing buzzing sound. Something that those amongst the party who are familiar with the arcane would recognize as a creature that originates from the abyss, as it immediately flies away with the item it has nabbed from the altar. A successful perception check from any of the party that wishes to make a free perception check, or someone with a sufficiently high passive perception, will notice that the item is some sort of amethyst crystal, with some strange writing on it that's hard to make out. The combat progresses as the Chasme is beelining it somewhere else in the swamp. No pun intended. And based on the direction it is flying, it's heading towards the Yulunere ziggurat. What Edwin, Yozel, and Yarrell are hoping to achieve is to either buy time for Zenibar, fighting fervently on his behalf, or to bring down the interlopers. The interlopers being the party in this case. Whilst Edwin fights more defensively, opting to flurry with his rapier and inspiring his comrades to dodge, Yarrell is more of a reckless berserker, raging and chopping away with his greatsword. Yozel is more akin to an arcane archer, opting to pluck away at the party's more isolated members, whilst using his arcane longbow to pierce their defences. As a trio, they can be quite formidable. When the combat is resolved, the puzzle shifts over to figuring out what Zenibar might be planning to do, and learning some of the more in-depth history of Yulunere, for which there are several avenues. The first avenue could be the altar itself, with several sections of text written in abyssal into the altar. These texts, once translated, describe how the amethyst crystal upon the altar is intended to preserve and restore the legacy of Yulunere when the time is right. That Yulunere will someday, once more, commence its research on the abyss. The second set of clues for the puzzle are the engravings on the crumbled pillar, depicting how the ziggurat was once used to infuse people with abilities derived from the abyss, with the ability being depicted on this pillar being the wild shape into a Chasme capability that Zenibar performed. Lastly, conducting an investigation of the campsite will result in the party finding a diary that goes into pretty extensive detail. Details about how Zenibar is the prime candidate to become the chief inheritor of Yulunere, being able to channel the abyss through his druidic abilities, and that in order to begin the inheritance for the surviving descendants of Yulunere, he will have to complete a ritual at the ziggurat with a crystal recovered from a lesser altar somewhere in the swamps. All of these clues are meant to further convey that Zenibar is heading right for the ziggurat, and that when he gets there, he will undertake a rather abyssal ritual. There are other details about the history of Yulunere that can be discovered as a result of investigating this section of the ruins. Yulunere being once at the forefront of all research on the abyss in this section of the world, was something that the inhabitants took great pride in. They built the ziggurat at what they would describe as a focal point, a place where the barriers between the planes were considerably weak enough for their purposes. The ziggurat was constructed to peer into the abyss through this focal point, using a trio of arcane crystals with a converging focus enchantment. Part of the research that was undertaken at the ziggurat involved discovering ways for its citizens to take up aspects of the abyss. They were intending to use magic derived from the abyss as a means by which to defend against its demonic corruption. And if that sounds like it would backfire, it did. Whilst at first the abilities derived from the research that were applied to its citizens granted them incredible boons that allows Yulin to be safeguarded from its enemies in the ancient past, this came at a cost. Those citizens slowly lost their minds to the whims of the demonic influence of the abyss, as the corruption took hold. It was assumed by the researchers that something had gone wrong with these enchantments. Only, they had no clue just how wrong they were. The tragedy of Yulin wasn't a singular defining event that resulted in its loss. It was a series of events that culminated in Yulin experiencing its own miniature calamity, as its society slowly descended into abyssal madness. Madness that caused the downfall of Yulin. And it certainly seems as though Zinabar is keen on causing a repeat of this calamity. Regardless of whether the party are successful at figuring out these clues and what they all mean, regardless of how much of the lore the party is able to discover, what is clear is that they have to somehow stop Zinabar. And with the Kazme having flown off towards the ziggurat, yes, it is entirely possible that the party might skip over learning about the lore behind Yulin and instead get back into the canoes to chase after Zinabar. It's also possible that the party, with the fight having just happened, might go back to converse with Urquhart Rosnar to get his assistance with Zinabar. Whilst this is another divergence point in the dungeon where a decision can be made, the finale for the dungeon won't change that much. As the party, with or without Urquhart Rosnar, approaches the ziggurat, the sounds of people screaming can be heard as the party spots several canoes rowing away from the ziggurat in a variety of directions. If Urquhart Rosnar is with the party, because a lot more time would have passed as a result of asking for his assistance, the ritual atop the ziggurat would have resulted in some additional side effects. Side effects which include having several abyssal creatures roaming the mangrove swamps. Creatures which are currently hunting down the archaeologists, which will prompt Urquhart Rosnar to ask the party to deal with Zinabar, whilst he prioritizes defending and keeping the fleeing archaeologists safe. He cannot be persuaded to immediately assist the party with fighting Zinabar atop the ziggurat, but he would pledge to assist once the archaeologists are safe. The ziggurat of Yulin is a towering hexagonal pyramid, with a plateau at its peak that can be reached by climbing a wide set of stairs. These stairs follow a bent gradient, with a sharp ascent where the stairs meet the ziggurat itself. Jutting out of the ziggurat are 3 crystals on alternating sides of the structure. These crystals idly hum with their arcane resonance, one that a successful Arcana check will reveal correlates to the magic native to the Abyss. And this resonance seems to be cascading into the ziggurat itself as these arcane sparks emanate from these crystals. Somewhat high above the ziggurat, there's this shimmering vortex that radiates this sickening deep purple light, as it slowly floods the nearby lands with this darkening shroud. A successful knowledge check, most likely Arcana, would reveal that this portal seems to be siphoning something from, presumably, the Abyss itself. With Zinabar awaiting the arrival of the party atop the ziggurat, the party have to dock their canoes and head up the stairs to the top of the ziggurat. This is where any last words between Zinabar and the party would be shared. Zinabar would reveal that when Yulin fell, not all of its knowledge and magic were lost to history. From the time since it fell, a small group of survivors, a mix of the humans and lizard folk who once inhabited Yulin set out from the city with plans to someday have an inheritor return the city to its glory. Its glory as a place where the Abyss could be made to work for the people. In the time since Yulin-Aray's fall, those survivors worked on perfecting the magic accrued from the Abyss, and that as a result, he is now one of several that are able to effectively command the abyssal magic. And since he has now started the ritual to take on the role of the chief inheritor of Yulin-Aray, he is certain that he can bring Yulin-Aray back to prosperity, and that the party, having proven themselves to be capable, are free to join him as his subjects. Suffice to say, Xenobar seems almost gleeful that he has summoned abyssal creatures to attack the innocent archaeologists, and this offer to the party is little more than a ruse. He has no intentions of allowing the party to live, even if they were to turn around and help fight Urquhart Rosnar instead. If the party does bring up how it was the abyssal magic that undid Yulin-Aray, Xenobar would counter that with a rather generic speech about how the older Yulin-Aray was weak. A cliché speech delivered with a dispassionate attitude of him running out of patience with the party. And if the party decides not to bow down to him, it'll be a roll for initiative. This fight against Xenobar is a two-stage boss fight. In the first stage, Xenobar's stat block is that of an Abyss Druid, comfortable with fighting in both close quarters and at a distance with that corrupted druidic bolt, attacking twice with it in a turn. Be wary that despite having a seemingly flimsy health pool, he is able to cast spells as a legendary action between turns, and some of his spells can affect multiple characters at a time. That's secondary to the second stage of this boss fight. Due to that Abyssal Rebirth feature of his, at the end of the turn where his hit points are dropped to 0, he will stand up with a smirk to him. As he looks around at the party, he would laugh maniacally for a moment, before blanketing the area in this dark, veiling shroud. A dark, veiling shroud which he uses to cover himself, transforming into an adult Abyss Dragon. An Abyss Dragon is, perhaps unsurprisingly, a dragon with abyssal characteristics. It is considered to be both an aberration and a dragon, though it distinctly leans towards the former category. Its dark purple scales radiate with a malevolent aura, as its red eyes seem to pierce the soul of whoever is within its gaze. The tendrils emerging from its cheeks rhythmically undulate as it stares down its opponents, and the gem-like scales flanking the plate scales along the front of the body have a radiating blue glow. A radiating blue glow that also emanates from a pair of scaly stripes that run down its back. The purple mane on the back of the dragon's neck does little to make it seem friendly either. The spikes on the wings and the bladed tail only add to how formidable and dangerous this dragon appears to be. And for those of you who might be wondering, yes, this dragon is the one that would emanate those lair effects that would be seen at the end of the alternative finale. The second stage of this finale starts with Xenobar being at full health from this new form he has taken up, as well as taking an immediate extra turn regardless of initiative order. Naturally, the adult Abyss Dragon is considerably tougher, with much stronger spellcasting, the ability to mix rending attacks with at-will spells, and the capacity to teleport up to half its movement speed with a rending attack as a legendary action. This is going to be an intense second half of the battle. And now that he is a dragon, he also has a rather potent breath attack. This debilitating line of death that deals a mix of cold and necrotic damage, and which prevents healing on a failed save. The other legendary action that this dragon can undertake is being able to freely cast any of their at-will spells. If the party starts to falter, or else they get close to potentially losing this fight against the Abyss Dragon, the DM is certainly allowed to have Urquhart Rosnar arrive to assist with the fight. His aid would arrive sooner if the party brought Urquhart Rosnar with them, as he would have finished assisting the evacuation of the fleeing archaeologists. Whilst he does not have his Steel Defender present, he does bring his rather potent counterspell as a reaction to protect the party, the potential high damage of his breath attack, if he can avoid hitting the party, and his ability to heal the party. He would not have access to legendary actions as part of this assistance, however. Should the party prevail and defeat the Abyss Dragon, they would all notice that the portal above the ziggurat is very much still active. But with nowhere to seemingly direct its magic, it will begin to surge as the Abyss Dragon dies. A strong enough dispel magic will shut down the portal, but there is another solution. There are those big arcane crystals on the side of the ziggurat, and if Urquhart Rosnar is present, even he will concede that the crystals need to be destroyed, and will even assist with that effort. With the destruction of the portal, the defeat of Xenabar, and the goals of the Inheritors thwarted, that is where the dungeon technically ends. If we were to skip the rewards and the conclusion, whether or not Urquhart Rosnar turns up to assist the party, the rewards for the party are back at his lair. If Urquhart Rosnar is present, he will quite happily escort the party back to his lair, otherwise he'll be awaiting their return. And after some discussions about the events that took place and what the party discovered, we do have quite a few rewards on offer. Besides a considerable amount of gold for thwarting the abyssal threat, Urquhart Rosnar will offer some of his knowledge and unused magic items from his hoard. The knowledge, however, is a unique reward for this dungeon, as what will be imparted can vary. For any artificers, they will learn how to imbue acid resistance onto their constructs. Great for artillerist or battlesmith artificers, Urquhart Rosnar will also happily make items that confer acid resistance for the party and the knowledge on how to do so. And yes, this will extend to metallic armor such as full plate mail, because why not? And with these rewards, that's where this 5-room dungeon is intended to be wrapped up. It does wrap up with a few loose threads. Are there other inheritors out there, waiting and seeking opportunities to bring back Yulun Array? What will Urquhart Rosnar do with the rest of these ruins? What other secrets are hiding beneath the mangrove swamps of Anglos? These are all questions to consider another time, perhaps in the midst of an ongoing campaign. I have to give a huge shout out to both Mystic Arts and Nairobi for hosting the event. I will also have to give a huge shout out to Jason of the Enothe Strife channel, as he helped out tremendously with creating the stat blocks for the Abyss Dragon, the Abyss Druid, and the 3 cultists. And I also have to give thanks to my audience for watching this video. Please check out the other dungeons that have been made for Dungeon Jam this year. I have also included a link to the playlist, as well as the Google Drive folder where you can download this dungeon as a PDF, and the resources needed to host this on a virtual tabletop, if you so choose, down in the description below. Again, thanks for watching, and I shall see you all next time.